Thank you all for being here today at this very important event. My name is Aya, and I'm the President for Student Justice in Palestine. On behalf of all students who are a part of Student Justice in Palestine at UWM, we welcome you to this event and hope that you find it to be beneficial and insightful. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge a disturbing reality that we have faced for the past hours and days. We have received multiple threats from pro-Israeli extremists, groups online and on various social media platforms. These are clear attempts to silence the event and to intimidate us, and to prevent a scholar from speaking on a topic that goes against the narrative that many try to push. But why? But why try to silence us? Why are they so afraid of an open academic discussion on current events? The answer is simple, because truth is power. And tonight, despite the many efforts and threats to shut down this event, we are proud to stand here today, and we will not be silenced. As we gather, we recognize that this conversation is not just about theory or history. It is about the urgent and ongoing struggle for justice and for free speech, and for the right to name and resist genocide, particularly in Gaza. I want to take a moment to acknowledge and express our gratitude to our community sponsors, Islamic Society of Milwaukee, Muslim Women's Coalition, and Wisconsin Muslim Civic Alliance. Their support has been invaluable in making this event possible. Over the past year, we have witnessed an alarming crackdown on free speech and free assembly, particularly on campuses across the country. The repression we face today echoes past struggles from the free speech movement in Berkeley in the 1960s, led by Mario Savio, to the civil rights and anti-war movements. These movements challenged power, exposed injustice, and insisted on the right to speak the truth when those in power sought to silence it. And that brings us to today's guest, Dr. Norman Finkelstein. He is no stranger to speaking the truth in the face of repression. It is a great privilege to welcome Dr. Finkelstein, a scholar whose work has challenged the mainstream narrative on the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and because of that, he has made him a target of relentless attacks. Dr. Finkelstein is a son of Holocaust survivors. His parents endured the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps, and their experiences shaped his unwavering commitment to the truth and justice. He has spent decades researching history and the conflict, writing extensively on the misuse of the Holocaust memory to justify Israel policies, and exposing the power structures that suppress dissent. But for speaking truth to power, Dr. Finkelstein has paid a heavy price. He has been ostracized by many in the American Jewish community, blacklisted from academia, and marginalized in a public discourse, not because his scholarship is flawed, but because his conclusions challenge the status quo built on historical distortion and political convenience. We are here at a university, a place that should stand for free speech, critical thinking, and for an open exchange of ideas. If we cannot discuss the reality of Israeli occupation and the systematic oppression of Palestinians here, then where can we? If an academic of Dr. Finkelstein caliber can be silenced for his work, what does that say about the integrity of our institutions? The threats we have faced prove exactly why this conversation is necessary. The attempt to shut down this event only confirms the urgency for Dr. Finkelstein's work. We refuse to be intimidated. We refuse to let fear dictate what we can and cannot be said on our campuses. And today, we are grateful to hear from him directly. Before we begin, we want to establish a few ground rules to ensure that this event runs smoothly and that everyone has the opportunity to listen and engage respectfully. During Dr. Finkelstein's talk, we ask that there are no interruptions or side conversations. Please remain quiet and allow him to speak without disruption. We encourage thoughtful and engaging questions. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and someone with a microphone will come to you and you will have the opportunity to engage with Dr. Finkelstein. We may not get to everyone if there is not time. We welcome back and forth discussion during the Q&A only if you have the microphone. But any disruptions, including talking at a turn, interrupting, or anything beyond that, will result in the removal of you from the event. SJP, UWM staff, and UWMPD reserve the right to remove anyone who fails to follow these rules. If you are asked to leave, you will be given one warning, and if you refuse, you will be escorted out by UWMPD. If there are any disruptions, we ask that all audience members do not engage. Dr. Finkelstein is more than capable of handling any challenges. We do not want audience members responding to disruptors or getting involved in confrontations. Please let volunteers and staff handle it safely and quickly to remove the disruptor. We hope for a successful and smooth event, and we appreciate your cooperation in ensuring a respectful and safe discussion. With that, it's finally time to get started. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Finkelstein.
Firstly, we've requested the police be here to ensure the safety of the attendees, volunteers, staff, and of course, Professor Finkelstein. So don't be intimidated by their presence. We are requesting them to be here. And yeah, I know there's a lot of them, but again, we're requesting that the police be here. Secondly, we're just gonna wait for this to. Okay, perfect. Okay. Secondly, SJP has been working on this event for a couple months now. And in the process of putting this event together and publicizing it, UW-Milwaukee's administration has launched three, not one, not two, three separate investigations into SJP that are still ongoing. And that just highlights the repression that we've been facing here on campus, specifically the repression of Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim students. And I just want to point that out. But regardless, we are still here, we're still doing the event. We're happy to have Professor Finkelstein joining us, so thank you everyone for coming out today. And without further ado, let's begin. So let's talk about the ceasefire in Gaza. As we all know, a three-phase ceasefire agreement took effect on January 19th, beginning with a 6-week ceasefire and the exchange of all Israelis held in Gaza for some of the Palestinians held in Israel. What do you make of the structure of the ceasefire deal, the 3 phases, and why is it that a deal drafted in May of 2024 was accepted just a couple weeks ago?
Like most questions in general, and in particular pertaining to the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's important to be knowledgeable about the factual historical record, not just the present, but the past. Now, there are actually a majority of older people in the audience, but for the sake of the younger people in the audience, I just have to go back a bit. Beginning in 2008-9, Israel conducted what it called operations in Gaza of a very significant magnitude. They called them not just operations, but they called them mowings of the lawn in Gaza. And the best known ones are Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, began December 26, 2008, and it ended January 17th, 2009. That's not a trivial fact. It ended 3 days before Barack Obama was inaugurated president, and Obama, being a stupefying narcissist, didn't want any distraction from his inauguration, so he gave the order to the Israeli government at the time, it was Ehud Olmert, to end Operation Cast Lead. After Cast Lead, there was an agreement of sorts, and the agreement had two aspects: the ceasefire and lifting or easing the brutal, criminal, medieval blockade of Gaza that began, or its most intensive phase began in January 2006, when Hamas won the parliamentary elections and in effect became the government. The ceasefire happened. The lifting of the blockade did not. In 2012, there was Operation Pillar of Defense. It lasted a shorter period of time. It lasted only a week. And that too ended with a ceasefire, and it was supposed to end with an easing or lifting of the blockade. When the agreement came before the Israeli government, at that time, Ehud Barak was the defense minister. And he said, once the ceasefire is signed, everything else in the agreement will be, everything else in the agreement, apart from the ceasefire, will be forgotten. That means the part about lifting the blockade or easing the blockade of Gaza. Same thing happened during Operation Protective Edge, July-August 2014. It was 51 days. It ended August 26th. I think it started July 7th, if my memory is right. Again, there was the ceasefire and then the promise to ease or lift the blockade of Gaza. The first happened, the second didn't. I should also add, on May 31st, 2010, there was a humanitarian flotilla en route to Gaza, carrying humanitarian materials, cement, because Israel at that point was not allowing cement into Gaza. It came under Israeli attack, the flotilla. The Israeli commandos killed 9 passengers aboard the flagship vessel, the Mavi Marmara. A 10th died later. After the Mavi Marmara incident, it was an international, it evoked international furor. After it, there was the promise to ease the blockade of Gaza. Never happened. So now we come to the present. There's this 3-stage, as it's called, agreement. As some of you will know, stages 2 and 3 are not even part of the public record. Just stage 1 has been published. Judging from the record, we can say the following things. Number 1, why was it signed now? There the answer is perfectly obvious in my opinion, though many people disagree. To my thinking, it's obvious. Namely, a month before President Trump was inaugurated, he said all hell would break out if the hostages weren't released. Well, he had 2 problems. It was a bit late in the day to threaten all hell, because all hell had broken out under President Biden. There was not much left hell to inflict on Gaza. Number 2, as everybody knows, the Israeli genocide in Gaza gradually became unpopular even in the United States. And so President Trump didn't want to begin his term of office like a monster, because he recognized he's not a genius politician, but doesn't require one to understand he doesn't want the Gaza albatross on his watch. So he's not going to unleash even more firepower on the defenseless refugee child population. On the other hand, he doesn't want to come across like a blowhard. He threatened all hell would break loose if the hostages weren't released. And so he basically conveyed to Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, you have to release the hostages. Or I should say, you have to have a hostage exchange for the Palestinians being held hostage. You have to have a hostage exchange. But the rest, like Ehud Barak said after Operation Pillar of Defense, it'll all be forgotten. In my opinion, probably the whole hostage aspect, as in hostage for hostage, that will be played out. The rest clearly will never be played out. Israel did not spend 16 months to reduce Gaza to rubble, to suddenly decide, along with John Lennon in my generation, let's give peace a chance and rebuild Gaza. That's not plausible. That's not credible. That's not believable. So that first phase, the ceasefire and hostage for hostage, will be carried out. The rest, one has to be honest about these things. We're all adults in this room, and part of respecting people is not to paint rosy pictures. We have to have a firm handle on reality as we figure out how to go forward. And right now, I think everybody in this room knows the picture is very grim. It's not grim because of what President Trump pronounced a couple of days ago, that he's going to build a golf course and a casino in Gaza. That's not the grim part. The grim part is a physical reality. The physical reality is Gaza is no more. The last UN statistics I looked at from a couple of weeks ago said that, number one, 92% of the homes in Gaza have either been destroyed or seriously undermined. What's the word? Damaged. 92%. There's 50 million tons of rubble in Gaza. I want to give you a sense of what 50 million tons means. I mentioned earlier Operation Cast Lead. For those old enough to remember 2008-9, when Operation Cast Lead happened, it was a horror on a scale not seen before. And I wrote a little book on the topic, and I took the title from an Israeli journalist named Gideon Levy, and the title was, "This Time We Went Too Far." And for those who remember those days, there was huge outrage at Operation Cast Lead. Well, at the end of Operation Cast Lead, the estimates were there were 600,000 tons of rubble. So put that number in your head. 600,000 tons of rubble. Operation Protective Edge in 2014, July, August 2014, Operation Protective Edge, it was such a monstrosity that the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, his name was Peter Maurer, and his job description was basically just to tour war zones. He came to Gaza after 2014, and he said, and I'm quoting him now, "In all my professional life, I've never seen the level of destruction I saw in Gaza." At the end of Operation Protective Edge, the estimate was 2.5 million tons of rubble. And in fact, by 2023, Gaza hadn't even rebuilt from Operation Protective Edge. So we had 600,000 tons of rubble. This time we went too far. We had 5 million tons of rubble. I've never seen destruction like this ever before. And now we come to Gaza 16 months later. You know what the figure for the rubble is? 50 million tons. 50 million tons. The best estimates are, if Israel were to allow in 100 trucks a day, which will never happen, if it were to allow in 100 trucks a day, it would take 15 years just to clear out the rubble. The rubble is mixed in with unexploded ordnance and toxic substances. So, it's hard. I won't start going through the question of the infrastructure that was destroyed, waste, sanitation, electricity, all of it was systematically destroyed. The biggest misnomer, the biggest misapprehension about Gaza in the past 16 months, the biggest falsehood about Gaza the past 16 months, is that it was a war with Hamas. It wasn't a war, and it wasn't with Hamas. Hamas was just a sideshow. The goal was, and the Israelis made it absolutely clear. One of the interesting aspects of this past 16 months is there was a large number of compilations of just statements by from the senior officials down to the lowest level, across the political spectrum, and including every aspect, division of civil life in Israel. And what comes across with a kind of mind-numbing detail is the goal was to destroy Gaza. It had nothing to do with Hamas. Hamas was a sideshow. Israel was determined, as I said earlier, they used to call their operations mowings of the lawn. And this time around, they decided, we're not mowing the lawn anymore. We're going to extirpate, that's the fancy word for pull out by the roots. We're going to extirpate every blade of grass in Gaza. And they were going to do it basically 3 ways, but each of the modus operandi, they overlapped. 1, we're going to try a mass ethnic cleansing. And at the time, some of you might recall, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, went to Egypt and tried to convince the head of state to accept the mass expulsion into the Sinai. Blinken said no. And so the mass ethnic cleansing was put on hold. It's not true that it was totally unsuccessful, depending on who you read, between 100 and 200,000 people in Gaza have left in the past 15 months. I read a figure this morning of 100,000. I've seen other figures saying closer to 200,000. But on the whole, it was unsuccessful. The second method was just an outright genocide, just an outright mass killing. And that too, by any comparative reckoning, was remarkably successful. If you look at standard indices, number of civilians to combatants killed, number of children to total number killed, number of women and children versus adult males killed. If you look at all the standard indices, number of journalists killed, number of medics killed, number of UN workers killed, by every measure, Gaza is in a class so completely its own. I'll give you one example. In the first 3 weeks of October 7th to October 31st, the estimate is 1,900 children were killed. So fix that number in your mind, 1,900. Most everybody will agree that Assad's regime in Syria was a very brutal regime. I don't think there's, his first name slipped my mind. Bashar. I remember his story. So it was a brutal regime. I think it's silly, pointless, and embarrassing to argue otherwise. And the most brutal year of his regime was said to be 2016. You know how many children were killed in the worst month of 2016 in Syria? 279. In the worst month, Gaza, in 3 weeks, 1,900. Actually, in the worst year in Syria, the year 2016, the total number of children killed under that brutal dictatorship of Bashar Assad, roughly the same number, 1,900 and something, were killed in 1 year, as in Gaza in 3 weeks. And so the genocide phase, by any comparative reckoning, was quite successful in Gaza. But the overarching goal was very simple. We're simply going to make Gaza uninhabitable, and then the people will have to leave. Now, you might say on Monday morning quarterbacking in light of what the statements have been made in the past week or so. I said it from day one. It was, if you look at it, I did 1,000 interviews, and you will see in every one I said the goal was to make Gaza uninhabitable, so as to say the population has to leave. There's nothing to go back to. And that's exactly what they achieved their goal. I don't want to engage in an open quarrel now because we need solidarity, but I find it silly beyond words when people say Israel lost the war in Gaza, Hamas won the war in Gaza. There was no war in Gaza. There was a genocide in Gaza. It targeted the civilian population, and its goal was to once and for all to solve the Gaza question.